Um, we're going to change gears just a little bit. We heard a lot about corn, and I, I noticed on Dan's slides, these aren't your grandfather's hybrids anymore. And looking around the room, I probably knew most of the dads and grandpas better than I do who's in the room right now. But um, there's some things starting to happen, and I guess probably what prompted this conversation is every other week, Rick and company have an update meeting, and there's some changes that are happening in and around uh, renewable diesel versus biodiesel. So if you think back in the days, there was a time where biodiesel was a big deal. Really, all biodiesel ended up being the contrast between the two. Biodiesels, you take carbon fuel, and you dump some soybean oil in it and call it biodiesel. It's kind of a green feel to it. Renewable fuel is an entirely different animal in that they take or intend to take the oil products, and there's really only two of the oil seeds that are certified for renewable fuel today, and that would be soybeans and canola. And we'll talk a little bit about sunflowers, which I don't quite understand why that hasn't become a part of it. But this green diesel wave that we're starting to hear is very similar to what you would have heard about in the ethanol run up when that was a really big deal 20 years ago. And turning corn into ethanol was a form of green diesel. But what's really driving the renewable part of that, if we were at a meeting in San Diego about a year ago right now, and there was a lot of bankers, people from the Fed, and also people from Pepsi-Cola. So the consumer that doesn't know anything about what we do in agriculture, they're really driving the demand because they think it's cool. So once the bankers got behind this, they went to all of the major companies, and it doesn't matter if it's a major chemical company, a seed company, a CHS, an ADM, Cargill. They went to the big players that really are involved in what happens with the disposition and disposal, if that's the right word, for the crops that we raise. So they went to those major companies, and it includes Monsanto and all of the chemical manufacturers. Basically told them, if you need seasonal loans, seasonal money, and you're not green, and by green they talk about being carbon neutral. Sustainability is another word that comes up. If you ask that question around this room or anywhere on the street, what's sustainability mean? You're going to get 10 or 12 different answers because nobody can really truly define what sustainability means. And secondly, this carbon capture thing, which we'll talk a little bit about, is turning into quite an animal on itself. So that's what's driving what it appears to be a renewable diesel fuel wave that's coming up. So ethanol, when that became a thing, it overbuilt, and it ramped up to where it's consuming 5 billion bushels of the corn that's produced in North America every year. North America is a 14 to 15 billion bushel corn country or continent. And the ethanol demand is consuming 5 billion of that, or about a third of that, turning it into ethanol. So you get around 2.8 to 3 gallons of ethanol out of every bushel of corn. It's been at 15 billion bushels of ethanol, and that has just flatlined. It hasn't changed, and it doesn't appear like that's as cool as it was at the time, but ethanol is considered a green diesel. So any of the major companies, if they happen to have an ethanol plant, that gives them a little bit of green credit, but not near enough to be this carbon neutral thing. So you switch that over to renewable diesel. The ethanol thing has built up. It reset itself. A lot of companies went bankrupt, and now it's at a place where it appears to be sustainable as long as the subsidies stay viable. So you think about diesel fuel, and when we tried this biodiesel thing, that kind of died on the vine because blending either soybean oil, any kind of oil with just fossil fuel, the flowability and all of that in wintertime, it just doesn't work. So now what's happening in North Dakota at Green Bison, if you've heard of that, that's at Spiritwood, North Dakota. They have built a soybean crushing plant at Spiritwood that will consume right at 50 million bushels of beans every year. That particular company is owned jointly by ADM, which is 75% owner, and Marathon Oil, which is a major oil company, owns the other 25%. That seems like a weird relationship to have essentially a grain handling company, feed manufacturing company partner with a major oil company. The reason for that is they're both looking for the carbon credits. So Green Bison, they took their first new crop beans this fall. They have the ability to crush 150,000 a day, 150,000 bushels a day, which if you do the math on that, just gets you really close to that 50 million bushels a year. Then you go to Castleton, North Dakota. There's yet another soybean crushing plant that's in construction right now, should come online somewhere toward the end of 24, might be ready for the harvest of 24. That's another 50 million bushels. And the third one that's happening in the state of North Dakota is there's one announced up in the Grand Forks area that's going to be very similar. I'm not sure who the players in that one are. The one at Castleton is a joint venture between Consolidated Grain and Barge, which is a grain handling company on the Ohio River. And their main goal in life is to gather grain out of the country and ship it down the river. And they partnered with the Minnesota soybean processors. So there's 3 of them in North Dakota, and then you probably all have heard or are familiar with the AGP plant that was built in Aberdeen. So there's another 50. So just simple math, adding up those rough numbers, that's 200 million bushels of soybeans that'll end up being crushed in this general geographic area sometime between, thanks, Mike, sometime between now and the end of 26. If you look at the production of soybeans in the state of North Dakota, so if we built a border wall between North and South Dakota, sounds like Trumpism, but it would be cool if we could do that. Within the border of North Dakota, the annual production of soybeans is around 192 million. So in theory then, the vast majority of the beans that are produced in the state of North Dakota could be planted, combined, produced, crushed, and never leave the state of North Dakota. And then you throw AGP in Aberdeen, that pretty much consumes that. So as you look at the changes in acreage we've watched over time, just from the business perspective, we're traditionally wheat country, but we're seeing the migration of corn and soybeans both trying to work their way even down to lemon. As it stands today, they've made it to a line somewhere around Glen Ullin, Flasher. If you do that line northwest to southeast, you'd be pretty close to where they've really had the success with it. And soybeans, if you've ever grown soybeans, then you know that late season rain, that late July, early August rain is really critical to get the production out of them. And just recently, if you think of canola, and I think Marla asked this question on one of those calls of why is canola hanging on to its value when sunflowers are in the tank? And the reality of all of that is the demand when canola got the green stamp to be used in the renewable fuel production, that's kind of buoyed that market against what sunflowers have. It's if you think about that too, 192 million bushels of beans that would be produced in the state of North Dakota, if you have to ship those to export, That takes a lot of rail freight just to make that happen. So now the change in the trade flows is going to be a little bit different in that sucking sound around all of those bean crush plants is going to really switch a lot of the soybean delivery into a truck market versus something for rail. So thinking about what does that mean? When you take a soybean into a crush plant, you take in 60 pounds, what's going to come out of that is about 11 pounds of oil out of each bushel, and roughly 48 to 50 pounds of it is going to end up being soybean meal. So just doing the math on what 50 million bushels of beans would produce, and using spiritwood as an example, they're going to create 600 million pounds of bean oil out of these soybeans. It's going to go on rail, it's going to Dickinson, and it'll be refined in the state of North Dakota. So it never really leaves that until it becomes diesel fuel. My question then becomes, what are we going to do with 1.2 million tons per plant? For each of those crush plants, they're going to produce 1.2 million tons of soybean meal. If you spread that over the state, it's going to look like it snowed someplace, because that's a lot of soybean meal. And that's per plant. So the four that we just talked about, somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million tons of soybean meal is going to have to go somewhere. So that's going to start to consume some of the rail freight that maybe is traditionally used to move the soybean. If you look at the diesel demand in North America, just what is the daily demand on that? And I did some creative math there. The usage in North America is about 370 million gallons a day. And the renewable diesel production in the U.S., this is everything in North America, is about 2.86 million gallons a year. So there's still a lot of room in there, but as companies continue to look for ways to get that green carbon footprint to a neutral status, there's going to be more and more demand for it. And in theory, and what you read about renewable fuel is that it will perform very similar to fossil fuel, but it's 100% refined out of soybean oil. There's no fossil fuel included in it whatsoever. And gas, the demand on that is about 380 million, and the ethanol production at 15 billion ends up being about 11% of the gas sold in North America, either daily on an annual basis. 11% of that does contain ethanol. Where we're currently at with this renewable diesel fuel is about 6%. And we look for that, or the projections would look for that to probably get somewhere up 20% to meet the carbon neutral goals that are being demanded by the lenders or the banks. So as you change the acres, canola works fairly well. Corn has obviously taken over more acres, and if you look at that just simply from the standpoint of the business, most of the grain handling and the farms have really developed and had to add storage, because the grain handling facilities are geared more for crop. And now we're having to think about, call it 100 bushels plus of corn. That's a lot more volume that has to still happen. But we're also going to end up creating a fair amount of additional truck traffic, and soybean meal is still going to continue to consume some of that rail freight. So as you think about all of those things and the changes that it's going to create, there currently is today, and there's going to be some additional opportunity to consider how you would do the oil crops. And if we could ever get sunflowers to get the green stamp, we just heard from both Cargill and ADM that New Suns, the Middle Lake type sunflowers, they're not going to dump them. They're not going to start starting at the next crush season. They're not going to take New Suns. It all has to be Ohio Lake. But if you think about the production of that, where a sunflower has 40% oil. Soybeans are significantly less, probably in that 12 to 15%. And then you got canola somewhere in between those two, probably 28 to 30%. There's really no reason you can't refine sunflower oil and turn it into renewable fuel, but nobody's figured it out, or there's something more going on there. So then as you ratchet it forward, you've got all kinds of noise in the marketplace about carbon credits, carbon capture, all of that type of stuff. And I was at a board meeting in a different business at South Central Grain in Napoleon. I was over there Monday, I believe it was, and they were hearing from seed companies and some of the chemical companies that they're coming up with a cents per bushel value for credit. And the way it understands, it's more about the farming practices used. No-till is a good step in the right direction, but how much phosphate fertilizer to put on? What is your nitrogen demand? If you follow those rules, and if that becomes reality, then at some point there could be a cents per bushel. There's dollars per acre. There's all kinds of different ideas around it, but I don't think anybody can really describe what that is at this point either. So looking more globally, as you talk about trade flows, the wars that we have going on in the Black Sea and the Red Sea, which would be the two separate wars between Russia and Ukraine, and then all of that conflict that's going on in the Red Sea, that's going to change to some extent what the demand is and where the flows go on grain, whole grains, probably more so to the market. The Panama Canal can't be used, so if you take grain into the center Gulf today, you got to go all the way around South America to get where you could go through the Panama Canal. And the Suez Canal, because of the conflict, is pretty much directed all of the traffic that went through the Red Sea up through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean area. That's going all the way around Africa. So the transit times and all of that changed quite a bit. And who knows what that's going to be. Additionally, in the Canadian market, America, U.S., has been the biggest customer of the Canadian select crude, which they call it. It's a heavier crude oil. It's a sour crude that was coming into the U.S. all the way as far as the Gulf of Mexico. The Canadian government just spent $25 billion, and they created a pipeline that takes it to Vancouver. So that heavy crude that was at a discount coming in here to supply diesel, and in effect cheapen up what we have for fossil diesel, the vast majority of that could be exported out through Vancouver. So all of those things are going to come into play, but this renewable fuel thing really seems to be the thing that's looming on the horizon that's really going to have the biggest impact. Now, the cure for high prices is always high prices. That's some of the attraction for building these soybean crush plants right now, because the crack spread, that sounds bad, but that's really the term they use, which is the difference between the raw product and what you can sell it for, is astronomically high, no different than it was in ethanol 25 years ago. So at some point that industry probably will overbuild. Then it'll have a reset, but it feels like because of the demand from the consumers in North America, there is going to be a demand for that. So growing soybeans, canola, if we can get sunflower into it, I think that's going to probably be a play as you come into it. You think additionally about what happens if corn and beans take over more acres, what happens to wheat. That's still a wild card out there. Wheat, there's still a demand for wheat. There always will be a demand. But as the acre shrinks, that's going to change a little bit how that happens. So yeah, we'll be around for any questions further on, but that's really something to start thinking about, is how it changes the dynamics that the cattle industry one last thing as you think about all of that soybean meal coming, their predictions going forward is going to lower the cost of feed in the state or in the area for whatever demand you can use there. So they're a little bit uptight about that because cattle prices have been really fairly good if you look at it in relation to where they've been in the past. So the cattlemen don't like what's happening there, even though it's a better source of feed. They think it's going to drive down the price of cattle. The jury's still out on that too. So I think that's really all I had to talk, and we'll certainly field any questions on any of the topics when we get further down the road.